The water does not move in any direction that can be followed. It lifts, settles, and lifts again, without pattern or urgency, as though the surface has forgotten where it is meant to go. Light spreads across it in a thin, colorless sheet, broken only by small ridges that form and dissolve without consequence. There is no shoreline to interrupt it, no structure to give it scale. The horizon exists only as a soft division between tones, indistinct enough that it could disappear if you stopped looking for it. Even the air seems to hold still, carrying no sound beyond the low, continuous shift of water folding into itself. Something remains on that surface. Not anchored, not guided, only present, rising and falling with a motion that does not belong to it. Its shape is incomplete at a distance, merging with the same muted colors that surround it, until the eye adjusts and begins to separate object from water. Wood, perhaps, or canvas stretched thin across a frame that was never meant to endure this kind of exposure. Edges worn by friction, darkened by saturation. The structure carries no mark that suggests purpose now. It is no longer part of anything larger. It simply occupies space where nothing else does. Closer, there are small movements that repeat without intention. A shift of weight that does not correct direction. A hand resting where it last found balance. Fabric that has stiffened where it dried and softened again where it did not. Nothing here resolves into action. Each motion begins and ends in the same place, guided less by decision than by the need to remain upright, or at least above the waterline. The surface accepts all of it without resistance. It does not respond. It does not change. Time passes in a way that does not announce itself. There are no intervals marked, no shadows long enough to measure. The light lifts slightly, then fades, though not enough to suggest an ending or a beginning. It simply alters its tone, and the water follows. The object rises and falls within it, unchanged in position, unchanged in purpose. Nothing arrives to interrupt the repetition. Nothing leaves to suggest loss. What remains is a continuity that has no clear origin. You watch it without expectation, the way one watches something that has already settled into its condition. There is no anticipation of movement beyond what is already visible. The scene does not build toward anything. It holds. The air carries the same stillness, the same absence of direction. Even the smallest sound seems absorbed before it can travel, leaving only the soft, persistent presence of water shifting beneath what has been left upon it. Before the light shifts again, before the surface alters in ways too small to follow, stay here a moment longer, and if this stillness holds your attention, you can choose to follow it further, quietly, without interruption, by subscribing, so that these distant places remain within reach whenever you return. The surface remains unchanged long enough that the eye begins to accept it as fixed, even as it continues to move. Small ridges pass beneath the structure without altering its position in any meaningful way, as though the water has decided to carry without delivering. The material that holds its shape has begun to settle into the rhythm imposed upon it. Edges that once resisted now bend slightly with each rise, each descent, absorbing the motion instead of opposing it. There is no sign that it was meant to travel this way, only that it has begun to adapt to doing so. Closer still, the presence within it resolves not into action, but into persistence. Shoulders angled not for direction, but for balance. Hands placed not to steer, but to remain. The body has adjusted to the limited space without expanding beyond it, conserving movement in a way that suggests not strategy, but necessity. Fabric clings and releases with the shifting air, holding traces of salt that catch the light in brief, uneven patterns. The face, when visible, does not search. It rests in a forward position, aligned with nothing in particular, as though looking has become separate from expecting to find. There is no immediate sense of how this began. The scene does not offer its origin. It exists only in continuation, carrying forward a condition that has already taken hold. Whatever preceded this, impact, separation, command, has receded beyond the reach of observation. What remains is not aftermath, but a state that sustains itself without reference to what came before. Even the idea of interruption feels distant, something that belongs to another environment entirely. The water does not recognize absence. It does not register that something has been left upon it without guidance or return. It continues in the same restrained motion, holding everything at the same level of indifference. Light moves across the surface in slow gradients, never settling long enough to define a shape completely. The horizon softens further until it feels less like a boundary and more like a suggestion, something the eye continues to seek, even when it offers no confirmation. You remain at a distance, watching the condition rather than the outcome. Nothing here asks for interpretation. It unfolds without signaling meaning, repeating itself until repetition becomes the only structure that exists. The longer it continues, the less it resembles an event, and the more it settles into something quieter, more persistent. Not a moment, but a duration without clear edges. The surface without direction. The water continues without interruption, repeating the same restrained motion that neither builds nor settles. It does not gather force, and it does not release it. Each rise carries no intention beyond the next descent, and each descent resolves into another rise that feels identical to the one before it. There is no accumulation, no pattern that can be followed forward or backward. The surface remains consistent in its indifference, offering no variation that might suggest movement toward anything beyond itself. The structure upon it adjusts in small ways that no longer appear deliberate. The angles at which it rests shift gradually, not to correct its position, but to accommodate the rhythm beneath it. Wood that once resisted now absorbs the motion, bending slightly at points where pressure repeats. Canvas pulls taut, then loosens, its surface holding moisture that gathers and disperses without forming anything stable. Nothing here is repaired. Nothing here is improved. The materials simply endure, settling into a condition that has already begun to define them. Within that limited space, the body follows a similar pattern. Movement occurs only when the surface requires it. A shift in balance is answered by a slight adjustment of weight. Hands find positions that reduce strain, then remain there until discomfort forces another change. The effort is not directed outward. It does not aim to alter course or create progress. It is contained entirely within the boundaries of what is necessary to remain present on the surface. Even breathing begins to follow the rhythm imposed by the water, lengthening and shortening without conscious control. There are remnants of structure that linger, not in action, but in posture. The way the shoulders hold tension as though expecting instruction. The way the gaze aligns forward, even when there is nothing to orient toward. These are habits carried from a different environment, where movement had direction and time had sequence. Here, they persist briefly, not because they serve a purpose, but because they have not yet faded. The body remembers before it forgets. The light shifts in slow, almost imperceptible gradients. It does not cast strong shadows, and it does not define edges clearly. Instead, it spreads evenly, flattening the surface into a continuous field of muted tones. The structure blends into it at a distance, its outline softened until it becomes part of the same texture. Only when the motion lifts it slightly above the surrounding water does it separate again, briefly visible before returning to the same level. Sound remains minimal, contained within a narrow range that never expands. The water produces a low, consistent movement, folding against itself with no variation in force. Occasionally, a small impact, wood against water, fabric against frame, interrupts it, but only momentarily. The sound does not carry. It does not echo. It disappears almost as soon as it forms, leaving the same subdued presence that existed before it. Time continues, though it does not mark itself in ways that can be measured. There are no clear transitions, no distinct phases that separate one moment from the next. The body begins to lose its sense of duration, responding only to immediate conditions rather than any broader sequence. What might once have been recognized as an hour or a day now passes without distinction, absorbed into the same continuous state. You watch as the small adjustments repeat, not as actions, but as responses that have become automatic. Nothing here suggests urgency. Nothing suggests delay. The surface carries everything at the same pace, a pace that cannot be altered by intention. The longer it continues, the more it resists interpretation, settling instead into a condition that simply persists, unchanged in its nature, though not entirely unchanged in what it holds. The position holds long enough that it begins to feel fixed, even as the surface continues to move beneath it. The body settles into a narrow range of motion, repeating the same adjustments until they no longer register as choices. Hands remain where they last found support, fingers resting against surfaces worn smooth by contact. The grip is neither tight nor relaxed, but sustained, just enough to respond when the structure shifts without warning. There is no attempt to anticipate the movement. It arrives, and the body follows. Clothing carries the memory of earlier conditions, though it no longer serves the same purpose. Fabric that once marked rank or roll has flattened into texture, losing distinction as salt and moisture reshape it. Seams darken where water gathers, then lighten again as the air passes over them. Nothing dries completely. Nothing remains fully saturated. The cycle repeats without resolution, leaving the material in a constant state of transition that mirrors the surface beneath it. The gaze no longer travels far. It extends only to the edge of what can be seen without effort, then returns. The horizon remains present, but it does not draw attention in the same way. It exists as a line that offers no information, no variation that might signal change. Looking toward it becomes less frequent, replaced by a focus on what is immediate: hands, wood, the slight movement of water passing along the side. The distance holds no answer, and so it gradually loses relevance. There are moments when the body shifts without clear cause. A slight repositioning that does not correspond to the movement of the surface. A breath drawn more deeply than necessary, then released without urgency. These changes do not accumulate into action. They begin and end within the same limited space, leaving no trace beyond the brief sensation of having occurred. Even discomfort settles into a consistent level, no longer rising sharply, no longer demanding attention beyond what is required to endure it. The light continues its slow alteration, though it never reaches an extreme. It softens, then brightens, but always within a range that maintains the same subdued tone. Reflections appear briefly along the water, thin lines that move with the surface before dissolving into the surrounding texture. They do not illuminate anything fully. They pass across surfaces without defining them, leaving the scene unchanged in its overall form. Sound remains contained, repeating the same narrow variations that do not expand into anything larger. The water moves against the structure with a quiet persistence, producing a rhythm that does not accelerate or slow. Occasionally, a shift in weight alters the pattern slightly, but only for a moment. The sound returns to its original form almost immediately, as though it cannot sustain deviation. There is no clear boundary between one period and the next. The body does not mark the passing of time in distinct intervals. Instead, it adjusts continuously, responding to immediate conditions without reference to what came before. Memory begins to lose its edges, blending recent moments into a single, extended present. What remains is not a sequence, but a duration that continues without interruption. You remain at the edge of the scene, watching as repetition replaces variation. Nothing develops beyond what has already been established. The structure rises and falls. The body adjusts and settles. The surface continues without direction. The longer it persists, the more it resists change, holding everything within a condition that does not need to progress in order to continue. The first separation. Before the surface settled into repetition, there had been a moment that did not repeat. It does not return clearly, but traces of it remain, not as a sequence, but as fragments that have not yet dissolved into the same continuity as everything else. A sound sharper than the water that surrounds it now. A shift in motion that did not follow the slow rhythm of waves, but interrupted it. The body does not recall it as an event with edges, only as a disruption that separated one condition from another without allowing time to understand the difference. The structure that now carries weight was not always alone. It had been part of something larger, held within a system where movement had direction and purpose. There were surfaces that connected, materials that aligned with one another to form stability. That cohesion no longer exists, but its absence has not fully settled. The body still holds the outline of that earlier environment, not in memory that can be described, but in tension that has not yet released. Shoulders remain slightly elevated, as though expecting resistance beneath the feet that is no longer there. Water had not always been at this level. It had existed below, contained, or at least separated from where the body moved. When it rose, or when the body descended toward it, the distinction collapsed. The surface that now surrounds everything was once something to avoid, to measure, to navigate. Now it is constant, leaving no boundary between what is above and what is at risk of falling below. The body carries this change without fully adjusting to it, maintaining small precautions that no longer prevent anything. There are impressions of others, not as individuals, but as proximity. Movement that once occurred nearby, coordinated or at least shared within the same space. The absence of that movement does not register immediately as loss. It fades more gradually, replaced by the consistency of being alone. The body does not search outward in response. It remains oriented inward, maintaining its own balance rather than seeking confirmation of anything beyond it. The moment of separation did not allow for preparation. There was no gradual shift into this condition. It arrived fully formed, removing structure faster than it could be replaced. The body responded in the only way available, by holding on to what remained within reach. That response persists, even now, long after the initial disruption has passed. Hands continue to rest where they found support during that first adjustment, as though the action never fully concluded. The surface offers no reflection of that earlier moment. It carries no trace of impact, no visible disturbance that marks where the change occurred. It has returned to its steady motion, absorbing the interruption without retaining it. Only the body carries evidence that something shifted beyond its control. Even that evidence is incomplete, already softening at the edges, becoming less defined with each repetition that follows. Time does not separate that moment from the present in a way that can be measured. It exists alongside what is now, not as a past event, but as a condition that initiated the current state. The body does not revisit it directly. Instead, it moves within its consequences, adjusting to a reality that no longer includes what came before. The separation remains, not as something that continues to happen, but as something that has already settled into permanence. You watch as the fragments linger without assembling into a clear image. They surface briefly, an angle, a sound, a sensation, then recede again into the same continuity that surrounds everything else. Nothing resolves. Nothing clarifies. The separation is not explained. It simply remains, embedded within the condition that now holds steady on the surface without direction. The traces do not arrange themselves into a sequence. They remain scattered, appearing without order, then fading before they can be held in place. A brief sense of impact returns in the form of pressure rather than sound, as though the body remembers force more clearly than it remembers cause. The sensation passes quickly, leaving behind only a slight tightening across the shoulders, a residual awareness that something once pressed against it with urgency that no longer exists. The surface beneath does not respond to this memory. It continues its steady motion, unaffected by what it does not retain. There had been edges once, clear lines that separated one space from another, one movement from the next. Those edges are no longer visible, but the body still behaves as though they remain. The way weight shifts cautiously, avoiding a boundary that cannot be seen. The way the feet, when they find purchase, hesitate before committing fully, as if expecting resistance to change suddenly. These responses do not align with the present environment, yet they persist, carried forward from a structure that no longer surrounds them. The absence of others settles differently than the presence once did. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It becomes apparent only through the lack of interruption. No movement occurs nearby to draw attention outward. No shared adjustment alters the rhythm of the surface. The space that once held multiple bodies now holds only one, and the difference is not measured by comparison, but by the quiet consistency that replaces variation. The body does not turn to confirm it. It accepts the absence without examining it closely. The moment of separation did not conclude in a way that marked its end. There was no clear transition into what followed, only a gradual realization that what had been connected was no longer present. That realization does not return as a thought. It exists as a condition, an understanding embedded in the way the body no longer expects coordination, no longer aligns its movements with anything beyond itself. Even the smallest adjustments are made in isolation, without reference to a shared rhythm. Water continues to move in the same restrained pattern, offering no indication that anything has changed beyond what it carries. It does not preserve the disturbance that once interrupted it. It has absorbed that moment completely, leaving only the current motion to define it. The surface rises and falls with the same consistency, holding the structure in place without guiding it toward anything that might suggest direction or purpose. The lack of response becomes part of the condition, reinforcing the separation by refusing to acknowledge it. There are brief attempts to orient, not through deliberate action, but through small, instinctive movements that search for alignment. A shift of the head, a slight adjustment of the body's angle, as though trying to reconnect with a direction that once existed. These movements do not resolve into anything sustained. They begin, then stop, returning to the same limited range that defines the present state. The effort does not build. It dissipates, leaving no trace beyond the moment in which it occurred. Time continues without marking distance from that first disruption. It does not move away from it. Instead, it folds around it, carrying the condition forward without separating origin from continuation. The body does not revisit the moment directly, yet it remains shaped by it in ways that no longer require conscious recall. What happened is no longer something to be understood. It is something that has already become part of what is. You remain at a distance where the fragments do not demand clarity. They appear and recede within the same quiet field, never assembling into a complete image, never resolving into explanation. The separation holds, not as an event to be remembered, but as a condition that no longer needs to be named in order to persist. The rhythm that remains. The surface settles into a consistency that no longer feels temporary. The movement that once seemed incidental begins to define everything that follows. It does not change in speed or direction, only in small variations that do not accumulate into difference. Each rise is followed by a descent that mirrors it closely enough to erase any sense of progression. The pattern does not repeat exactly, yet it remains familiar enough that the body no longer reacts to each shift as something new. It adjusts in advance, not by anticipating the movement, but by becoming aligned with it. The structure has begun to respond in the same way. Its materials no longer resist the motion as separate forces. Instead, they yield in sequence, bending and settling in a rhythm that matches the surface beneath. Points of contact have softened where pressure is repeated, edges worn down into curves that no longer catch or hold. The frame does not hold its original shape with the same certainty. It adapts slowly, changing just enough to remain intact within the condition that surrounds it. Within that space, the body follows the same progression toward alignment. Movements that once required attention now occur with less effort, guided by repetition rather than intention. The shift of weight comes earlier, before the surface reaches its highest point. The hands adjust more smoothly, sliding along surfaces that have already been worn to accommodate them. Even the posture begins to settle into a form that minimizes strain, not by conscious choice, but by the gradual removal of positions that cannot be sustained. Breathing adjusts alongside these changes. It no longer follows an independent rhythm, but synchronizes loosely with the motion beneath. The rise of the surface extends the breath without forcing it. The descent shortens it, not abruptly, but with a quiet consistency that becomes difficult to separate from the movement itself. Over time, the distinction between internal and external rhythm begins to narrow. The body does not control the pace. It follows it. The light continues its slow variations, but it no longer draws attention in the same way. Its changes are absorbed into the larger continuity, noticed only when they alter something immediate, a surface catching a brief reflection, a shadow forming where none had been. These moments do not accumulate into observation. They pass without being held, leaving the scene unchanged in its overall form. The eye remains focused on what is nearest, where the motion is most directly felt. Sound maintains the same limited range, though it begins to take on a quality that resembles pattern. Not a pattern that can be counted or predicted, but one that repeats often enough to become familiar. The water meets the structure in similar ways, producing small variations that echo previous ones. The body registers these sounds without interpreting them, recognizing their recurrence without assigning meaning. They become part of the environment, no longer distinct from it. There is no effort to create direction within this rhythm. The idea of moving toward something does not arise in a way that leads to action. Instead, the body remains oriented within the immediate space, adjusting continuously to maintain balance. The repetition removes the need for larger movement, replacing it with a series of small corrections that sustain the present condition. Nothing here builds toward change. It maintains itself through continuity. You watch as the alignment deepens, not through decision, but through the gradual elimination of what cannot persist. The surface continues as it always has, but the response to it becomes more consistent, more refined in its simplicity. What remains is not control, but adaptation, a quiet convergence between movement and response that no longer requires attention to sustain. The motion continues long enough that it begins to define what is stable. What once felt uncertain, each rise, each descent, settles into something expected, not because it can be predicted precisely, but because it no longer surprises. The body no longer waits for movement to arrive. It exists within it, carried by a pattern that does not require confirmation. Balance is maintained without searching for it. The corrections that once followed each shift now occur alongside it, integrated into the same continuous response. The hands begin to rest differently. Where they once pressed firmly, testing surfaces for reliability, they now settle with less force, trusting what has already proven consistent. Fingers no longer grip in anticipation of change. They curve lightly, maintaining contact without strain, adjusting only when necessary. The surfaces they touch have changed as well, smoothed by repetition, their edges softened into forms that guide the hand rather than resist it. The interaction becomes quieter, more efficient, requiring less effort to sustain. The body's posture reflects this shift. It no longer holds tension in the same way. Shoulders lower slightly, not from relaxation, but from the absence of immediate threat. The spine curves to match the limited space, finding a position that can be maintained over time. Movements that once sought to correct or improve now settle into maintaining what already works. The range of motion narrows, not by restriction, but by the quiet removal of positions that cannot be held without strain. The gaze continues to shorten its reach. It no longer extends outward in search of variation. Instead, it settles on the immediate surroundings, following the small, consistent movements that repeat within close range. The water passing along the edge, the subtle shift of material under pressure, the changing angle of light on a surface, these become sufficient. The horizon remains present, but it recedes into the background, no longer offering anything that competes with what is near. There are moments when the body pauses entirely, not because the surface has stilled, but because the need to respond has diminished. The rhythm carries it without requiring constant adjustment. In these intervals, movement becomes minimal, reduced to the quiet continuation of breathing and the slight repositioning that follows each rise and fall. These pauses do not interrupt the pattern. They become part of it, extending the sense of continuity rather than breaking it. The sound of water remains unchanged in its range, but its repetition begins to blend into something less distinct. Individual sounds lose their separation, merging into a continuous presence that does not call attention to itself. The body no longer distinguishes between one contact and the next. The rhythm becomes a backdrop, constant enough that it no longer requires recognition. It is simply there, accompanying everything else without standing apart from it. Time continues to move without marking its passage. The adjustments that once defined intervals now occur so seamlessly that they no longer divide one moment from another. The body does not track duration. It responds only to what is immediate, maintaining its position within the rhythm that has replaced all other structure. Memory of earlier variation fades further, leaving the present condition to define itself without reference. You remain at the edge of this steady repetition, watching as the distinction between movement and response continues to narrow. The surface carries, the body adjusts, and the pattern holds without interruption. Nothing develops beyond what has already been established. The rhythm does not lead anywhere. It persists, shaping everything within it, until persistence itself becomes the only form of change that remains. The narrowing of movement. The range of movement begins to contract in ways that are not immediately noticeable. Nothing is taken away suddenly. There is no single moment where ability shifts into limitation. Instead, certain motions simply occur less often, then gradually stop appearing altogether. The body does not resist this change. It follows it, adjusting to a smaller space of possibility without marking what has been lost. Where there had once been slight variations in posture, there is now a more consistent shape. The positions that require effort begin to fall away, leaving only those that can be maintained with minimal strain. The shoulders settle into a fixed angle. The spine curves within a narrow range that does not demand correction. Even the placement of the hands becomes more permanent, resting in positions that reduce the need for repositioning. Movement continues, but it is confined to what is necessary to remain aligned with the surface. The structure responds in parallel. Its materials have already adapted to the rhythm of the water, and now they begin to hold their adjusted forms more firmly. Flexibility remains, but within limits that no longer change. The surfaces that receive pressure have stabilized, shaped by repetition into configurations that no longer require adjustment. What had once been reactive becomes steady, not through reinforcement, but through the quiet settling of what endures. The effort required to maintain balance decreases, not because the surface has changed, but because the body has aligned itself more completely with its motion. Corrections become smaller, less frequent. The difference between movement and stillness narrows, until they begin to overlap. There are intervals where the body appears motionless, though it continues to rise and fall with the water. These moments do not signal rest. They indicate that adjustment has become continuous, no longer requiring visible change. Breathing follows this same narrowing. It becomes more regular, less responsive to variation in the environment. The depth of each breath remains within a limited range, neither expanding nor contracting significantly. The rhythm holds steady, shaped less by choice than by the condition that surrounds it. There is no need to alter it. It persists on its own, integrated into the broader pattern of movement. The gaze remains close, rarely extending beyond what can be seen without effort. When it does shift outward, it does not linger. The distance offers no variation that sustains attention. The horizon continues to exist as a soft division, but it does not draw the eye in the same way. It has become part of the background, present but without influence. What remains in focus is immediate, contained within the small space that continues to move with the surface. Sound holds its same restrained pattern, but it now blends even further into the surrounding condition. The distinctions between individual sounds diminish, merging into a continuous presence that does not require recognition. The body no longer responds to each variation. It exists within the sound rather than reacting to it. The environment becomes less defined by its individual elements and more by the continuity that binds them. There is no effort to expand beyond this narrowing. The body does not seek to recover the range it once held. It moves within the limits that have formed, maintaining them without question. What remains is sufficient for continuation. Nothing suggests that more is required. The condition has reduced itself to what can persist, and the body follows that reduction without resistance. You watch as the space of movement becomes more contained, not through force, but through the quiet removal of what cannot endure. The surface continues as it always has, but what it carries has changed in subtle ways. The narrowing does not announce itself. It unfolds gradually, shaping everything within it until the difference between what was possible and what remains is no longer clearly visible. The contraction continues without pause, though it no longer feels like a change in progress. It has settled into something quieter, less visible, where reduction does not announce itself through absence, but through consistency. The body no longer tests its limits in the same way. It does not reach beyond what is already known to be sustainable. The space it occupies becomes more defined, not by boundaries imposed from outside, but by the gradual shaping of what can continue without interruption. The hands remain where they have learned to rest. Their position is no longer adjusted with each shift of the surface. Instead, they hold a steady contact that absorbs movement without requiring response. Fingers maintain a gentle curve, not gripping, not releasing, but sustaining a level of contact that has proven sufficient. The surfaces beneath them have adapted in return, smoothing further where pressure repeats, guiding the placement without demanding attention. The posture stabilizes into a form that does not vary. It is not the result of conscious alignment, but of the removal of positions that could not be maintained. What remains is a configuration that endures, shaped by repetition and constraint. The shoulders no longer rise in anticipation of imbalance. They remain lowered, held in a position that requires less effort to sustain. The spine follows this pattern, settling into a curve that does not shift beyond a narrow range. Movement becomes increasingly subtle. Adjustments still occur, but they no longer register as separate actions. They blend into the ongoing motion of the surface, indistinguishable from it. The body does not pause to correct itself. It remains in a state of continuous adaptation, where change is present but not defined. The distinction between doing and being continues to diminish, leaving only the persistence of position within the rhythm. Breathing remains steady, though its depth no longer varies in response to the environment. It has settled into a pattern that aligns with a reduced range of movement. Each breath follows the one before it with minimal deviation, neither extending nor shortening beyond what is necessary. The rhythm holds, unaffected by the slight variations of the surface. It continues on its own, integrated into the condition that now defines everything else. The gaze remains fixed within the immediate space. It does not travel outward in search of change. The horizon, once a reference, now exists only as part of the background, offering no variation that holds attention. The focus remains on what is near, the surfaces that support the body, the small movements that repeat within reach. Even these do not draw sustained observation. They exist as part of the same continuity, no longer distinct enough to separate from it. Sound has lost what little variation it once held. It no longer presents itself as a series of distinct contacts or movements. Instead, it forms a constant presence that does not rise or fall. The water moves, the structure responds, but the sound they produce merges into a single, unbroken tone. The body does not respond to it. It exists within it, as it exists within the motion and the light, without distinction. Time continues without division. There are no clear intervals that separate one state from another. The narrowing has removed the markers that once defined progression. What remains is a continuous present, where each moment resembles the last closely enough that they no longer stand apart. The body does not track this passage. It remains within it, adjusting only to what is immediate. You observe as the condition settles into its most contained form so far. Nothing expands. Nothing returns. The surface carries everything within a range that has been reduced to what can endure without effort. The body holds its position within that range, no longer reaching beyond it, no longer testing its limits. The narrowing has completed another quiet step, not by removing what is visible, but by making what remains sufficient for continuation. The weight of exposure. The surface does not change, but what rests upon it begins to register something more constant than movement. It is not a force that arrives in waves or intervals. It does not gather or release. It remains, pressing evenly across everything it touches. The air carries it without direction, and the light reinforces it without intensifying it. There is no moment where it begins. It has simply become present in a way that does not recede. The body responds slowly, not by resisting, but by adjusting to its persistence. Skin that was once neutral begins to hold a different texture, shaped by contact that does not lift. The places most exposed register at first: hands, face, the edges of fabric where the body meets the air without protection. There is no sharp sensation that marks the change. It settles gradually, altering perception without announcing itself. The body does not withdraw. It cannot. It remains within it, adapting to a condition that offers no variation. Clothing no longer mediates the environment in the way it once did. Fabric that once served as a barrier has absorbed too much to maintain separation. It clings more closely, holding moisture and salt against the skin, creating a surface that neither protects nor releases. Where it dries, it stiffens slightly, then softens again when exposed to the air. The cycle does not resolve. It repeats, leaving the material in a state that mirrors the condition it no longer shields against. The structure offers little relief. Its surfaces have been shaped by repetition, but they do not provide insulation from what settles across them. Wood warms and cools without retaining either state. Canvas holds moisture without distributing it evenly. There is no part of it that creates distance from the surrounding condition. It carries the body, but it does not separate it from what persists around it. Movement continues within the narrowed range established earlier, but it now occurs within this constant presence. Adjustments that once followed the rhythm of the surface are now influenced by something less visible. A slight shift of the hand, not in response to movement, but to the sensation that has settled beneath it. A repositioning of the shoulders that does not alter balance, only redistributes contact. These movements do not remove the condition. They move within it, offering brief changes that do not last. Breathing remains steady, though it begins to carry traces of the environment it passes through. The air does not resist, but it does not refresh. It enters and leaves without altering its quality in a way that provides relief. Each breath continues the pattern, maintaining what has already been established rather than changing it. The body does not seek deeper or shallower rhythm. It remains within the same range, unaffected in form, though not entirely unchanged in effect. The light continues its slow variation, but it now feels less neutral. It does not intensify into heat that can be identified or avoided. It spreads evenly, maintaining a presence that does not fluctuate enough to be marked. Surfaces reflect it without altering it. The body receives it without reacting sharply. It becomes part of the same continuous condition, indistinguishable from the air that carries it. The gaze remains close, though it now moves even less. There is no incentive to look outward. The distance offers no difference that might suggest relief or change. The focus remains within the immediate space, where the body continues to adjust in small ways that do not resolve the condition, only redistribute it. Even these movements become less frequent, settling into the same continuity that defines everything else. You observe as the environment presses without force, holding everything within a condition that does not require variation to persist. The surface continues its steady motion, but what rests upon it now exists within something more constant, something that does not rise or fall. It remains, shaping the experience not through change, but through its refusal to change at all. The presence does not intensify, yet it becomes more difficult to separate from the body that carries it. What had once felt external, something resting across the skin, passing through the air, begins to settle inward in ways that do not announce a boundary. The body does not identify a point where contact ends and absorption begins. It continues to exist within it, but the distinction between being surrounded and being affected narrows until it is no longer clear where one becomes the other. The hands remain in place, though their contact with the surface changes subtly. Where they once registered texture, they now register pressure without detail. The fine distinctions between roughness and smoothness begin to fade, replaced by a more general sense of contact that does not vary. Fingers adjust occasionally, but the movements are slower, less precise. They do not seek a better position. They maintain one that has already proven sufficient, even as its effectiveness diminishes in ways that are not immediately noticeable. The posture holds, though it carries a different quality. It is not only sustained, it is endured. The shoulders remain lowered, but the ease that once accompanied that position has shifted into something more neutral, more fixed. The spine maintains its curve, though it no longer adjusts as readily to small variations in the surface. The body continues to align with the rhythm, but the alignment feels less responsive, more held in place by continuity than guided by adaptation. Clothing continues its cycle without offering relief. Fabric rests against the skin with a consistency that no longer changes between moments. The small variations, drying, softening, tightening, occur within such a narrow range that they no longer register as distinct. What remains is a steady contact that does not lift. The material does not protect. It does not separate. It becomes part of the condition itself, extending the reach of what settles across the body. Breathing maintains its steady rhythm, though its effect shifts in ways that do not alter its form. The air moves through the body without resistance, but it does not provide renewal in the way it once did. Each breath continues the pattern without offering change. The depth remains consistent. The pace remains even. What alters is not the motion, but the quiet sense that the motion no longer restores anything beyond its continuation. The gaze remains within the same confined space, though it now lingers less on any single point. Surfaces are still visible, but their distinctions have softened. The edges that once defined them appear less clear, blending into the surrounding texture. The eye does not strain to correct this. It accepts the reduced clarity, moving slowly between points that no longer hold sharp difference. The horizon remains present in the distance, but it offers nothing that draws attention away from what is near. Sound continues as it has, though it now feels more distant, even as it remains constant. The water moves, the structure responds, but the presence of sound no longer occupies the same level of awareness. It recedes slightly, becoming part of a background that does not require attention. The rhythm persists, but it no longer defines the experience as clearly as before. It exists, steady and unchanging, without demanding recognition. Time continues without division, though its passage feels less connected to change. The condition holds steady across moments that no longer differentiate themselves through variation. The body does not mark this passage. It remains within it, adjusting less frequently, responding only when necessary. The continuity becomes more complete, less interrupted by movement or perception. You remain at a distance, observing as the condition settles deeper without altering its form. Nothing intensifies. Nothing resolves. The weight of exposure does not press harder. It simply remains, becoming more integrated with what it surrounds. The surface continues its steady motion, carrying everything within a presence that does not lift, shaping the experience not through force, but through its quiet, unbroken persistence. The thinning of strength. The condition does not announce a new phase, yet something within the body begins to change in a way that no longer adjusts as easily as before. Movement continues, but it carries less assurance. The same small corrections occur, though they arrive a fraction later, as though the response must travel further before it takes form. There is no clear moment when this delay begins. It settles gradually, becoming noticeable only through repetition that no longer aligns as precisely with the surface beneath. The hands remain in place, though their contact shifts in subtle ways. Where pressure once distributed evenly, it now gathers unevenly across the points that bear the most weight. Fingers that once curved with ease begin to hold their position longer before adjusting. When they do move, the motion is slower, less defined, as though the distinction between intention and action has narrowed. The surfaces beneath them remain unchanged, but the way they are felt has altered, becoming less precise, less responsive to variation. The posture continues to hold, but its stability carries a different quality. It is no longer maintained through quiet alignment alone. It persists through effort that does not fully register as strain, yet accumulates in ways that cannot be entirely dispersed. The shoulders remain lowered, though they no longer settle as completely into their position. A slight tension returns, not sharp enough to demand correction, but present enough to remain. The spine follows its established curve, though it resists adjustment when the surface shifts more noticeably. Breathing maintains its rhythm, though its depth begins to fluctuate within a narrow range. The change is slight, not enough to alter the pattern, but enough to create small inconsistencies between one breath and the next. The air continues to pass without resistance, but it does not seem to extend as easily into the body. The motion remains steady, yet its effect diminishes in ways that do not interrupt its continuity. The gaze remains close, though it now shifts more slowly between points. The surfaces within reach appear less distinct, their edges softening further as attention moves across them. The eye does not linger long enough to refine what it sees. It passes over details that once held clarity, accepting a reduced level of distinction without attempting to restore it. The horizon remains distant, unchanged in its form, offering no variation that draws the gaze outward. The structure continues to respond to the motion of the surface, though its movements feel less supportive. It carries the body as it always has, but the interaction between them has altered slightly. Where it once absorbed movement smoothly, it now transmits more of it, requiring the body to adjust more frequently, though with less precision. The materials have not weakened in a visible way. They remain intact, though the sense of stability they provide has shifted. Sound continues in its steady pattern, though it now feels more distant, as though it has receded further into the background. The water moves, the structure responds, but the presence of sound does not occupy the same space in awareness. It persists without interruption, yet it no longer defines the environment as clearly. It becomes part of a broader continuity that holds everything within it without distinction. There is no attempt to counter this thinning. The body does not expand its movement to compensate. It remains within the narrowed range established earlier, adjusting only as much as is required to continue. The changes do not prompt reaction beyond what is immediate. They are absorbed into the condition, becoming part of the same steady progression that has shaped everything else. You observe as the alignment between movement and response becomes less exact, not through disruption, but through gradual alteration. The surface continues its steady motion, unchanged in its pattern. What it carries responds with less precision, maintaining position within a range that continues to narrow, not by force, but by the quiet reduction of what can be sustained. The change does not deepen through any sudden shift. It continues in the same quiet manner, extending what has already begun without drawing attention to its progression. Movements still occur, but they no longer complete themselves with the same clarity. A hand begins to adjust, then pauses briefly before settling, as though the motion must be carried through a space that has widened slightly between intention and completion. The delay is small, yet it repeats often enough to become part of the condition. The hands remain where they have learned to rest, though their contact feels less assured. Pressure is no longer distributed evenly. It gathers at certain points, then shifts again without fully resolving. Fingers maintain their curved position, but they do not adapt as readily when the surface changes beneath them. When they do move, the motion lacks the same definition, tracing a slower path that does not always align with what is required. The surfaces beneath them remain constant, though the interaction has lost some of its precision. The posture holds, though it now requires a quieter form of endurance. The shoulders maintain their lowered position, but they no longer settle into it completely. A slight tension persists, not enough to prompt correction, but enough to remain present. The spine continues to follow its established curve, though its ability to adjust has narrowed further. When the surface shifts more noticeably, the response does not arrive as smoothly, leaving small misalignments that linger before being absorbed into the overall position. Breathing continues without interruption, though its rhythm carries subtle irregularities. The depth of each breath remains within a limited range, but the transitions between them are less even. A breath extends slightly longer than the one before it, then shortens again without clear cause. The pattern does not break. It continues, though it no longer aligns as consistently with the motion of the surface. The body does not correct this. It allows the variation to exist within the same steady flow. The gaze moves more slowly across the immediate space, though it now holds less detail. Surfaces that once offered clear distinction appear more uniform, their edges blending into one another without sharp separation. The eye does not attempt to refine what it sees. It accepts the reduced clarity, passing over points that no longer hold the same definition. The horizon remains distant, unchanged in its softness, offering no variation that draws attention beyond what is near. The structure continues to carry the body, though its support feels less integrated. The motion it transmits is no longer absorbed as smoothly, requiring more frequent adjustment, even as the body responds with less precision. The materials remain intact, though their interaction with the body has shifted. What once felt continuous now carries small interruptions, subtle enough to remain within the same rhythm, yet present enough to alter the sense of stability. Sound persists as it always has, though it now feels further removed from immediate awareness. The water moves, the structure responds, but the presence of sound no longer occupies the same space in perception. It becomes part of a broader quiet, continuous and unbroken, yet less defined in its presence. The rhythm continues without change, though it no longer anchors the experience as firmly as before. Time continues without division, though its passage feels less connected to the body's response. Adjustments occur less frequently, and when they do, they resolve more slowly. The intervals between them lengthen, not because the surface has changed, but because the body no longer responds as quickly. The continuity remains intact, though it carries a quieter, less responsive quality. You remain at a distance, observing as the thinning extends without interruption. Nothing collapses. Nothing fails in a way that can be marked. Instead, the condition deepens through small alterations that repeat until they become the new form of continuity. The surface continues its steady motion, unchanged in its nature. What it carries remains within it, responding with less precision, yet still enough to persist. The quiet of thirst. The condition does not announce itself as a need. It does not arrive sharply or demand attention in a single moment. Instead, it settles into the body in the same way as everything else, gradually, without distinction from what surrounds it. At first, it exists as a slight dryness that does not interrupt breathing or movement. The mouth adjusts to it without effort, maintaining its usual rhythm, allowing the sensation to remain without defining it as something separate. Over time, the dryness holds longer between breaths. It no longer fades as easily, remaining present even as the body continues its limited adjustments. The tongue rests differently within the mouth, no longer moving as freely. The lips hold a slight tension that does not fully release. These changes do not alter behavior immediately. They exist alongside the established pattern, integrating into the same continuity that defines everything else. The body does not respond outwardly to this shift. There is no sudden movement to correct it, no expansion of effort to resolve it. Instead, small adjustments occur within the same narrowed range. A brief repositioning of the jaw, a slight parting of the lips, then a return to stillness. These motions do not satisfy the condition. They move within it, offering momentary variation without altering its presence. Breathing continues, though it begins to carry the dryness further inward. Each breath passes through the same air, unchanged in its quality, extending the condition rather than relieving it. The rhythm remains steady, but the sensation lingers longer with each cycle. It does not intensify sharply. It persists, becoming more consistent, more integrated into the body's awareness. The hands remain in place, though their movements slow further. The small adjustments that once occurred in response to the surface now happen less frequently. When they do occur, they carry a slight hesitation, as though the motion requires more from the body than before. The surfaces beneath them remain unchanged, but the interaction has grown quieter, less responsive to variation. The posture holds, though it now carries a different weight. It is not only maintained, it is sustained through a condition that no longer resolves between moments. The shoulders remain lowered, the spine curved within its narrow range, but the ease that once accompanied this alignment has diminished. The body does not shift to relieve it. It remains within it, allowing the condition to persist without interruption. The gaze remains close, though it now lingers less on any single point. Surfaces within reach appear more uniform, their distinctions softened further by the steady presence that surrounds them. The eye does not search for variation. It moves slowly, accepting what is visible without attempting to refine it. The horizon remains distant, unchanged, offering no indication of difference that might alter the focus. Sound continues within its narrow range, though it now feels even more distant. The water moves, the structure responds, but the presence of sound no longer occupies the same level of awareness. It persists without interruption, yet it no longer anchors the experience as it once did. It becomes part of the broader continuity, steady and unchanging. The body does not name the condition. It does not define it as thirst in a way that leads to action. It experiences it as part of the same environment that surrounds it, something that remains rather than something to be resolved. The absence of variation allows it to settle more deeply, integrating into the pattern that continues without interruption. You observe as the quiet of this condition spreads without force, shaping the body not through urgency, but through persistence. The surface continues its steady motion, unchanged in its form. What it carries remains within it, responding less, moving less, yet continuing in the same narrow range that has become sufficient for what remains. The dryness does not intensify in a way that can be marked. It remains, extending itself across each moment without altering its form. What changes is not the sensation, but the space it occupies. It lingers longer between breaths, no longer receding into the background as it once did. The mouth adjusts less effectively. The small movements that once redistributed the feeling, subtle shifts of the tongue, the brief parting of the lips, occur less often, and when they do not alter what remains. The lips hold their tension more consistently now. They no longer release fully between movements. The surface of the skin carries a slight rigidity, shaped by the same exposure that surrounds everything else. When they part, It is briefly, without intention, and they return to stillness without completing the motion in any meaningful way. The body does not attempt to correct this. It allows the condition to persist, integrating it into the same steady pattern that defines the rest of its responses. Breathing continues, though it carries the dryness deeper into the body with each cycle. The air remains unchanged, offering no variation that might interrupt the sensation. Each breath extends it, not sharply, but consistently, until the distinction between internal and external begins to narrow further. The rhythm holds, steady and unbroken, though its effect shifts quietly, adding to what is already present rather than replacing it. The hands remain where they have settled, though their responsiveness continues to diminish. Movements occur less frequently, and when they do, they resolve more slowly. The fingers adjust within a smaller range, maintaining contact without seeking improvement. The surfaces beneath them feel less defined, their texture no longer registering with the same clarity. The interaction persists, though it has lost the detail that once accompanied it. The posture holds without variation. The shoulders remain lowered, the spine maintains its curve, but the sense of ease that once allowed this alignment has faded further. It is now sustained through quiet endurance rather than passive adaptation. The body does not attempt to shift beyond this form. It remains within it, allowing the condition to continue without interruption. The gaze moves minimally, no longer traveling across the immediate space with the same slow curiosity. It settles, not on a single point, but within a narrow field that does not require adjustment. Surfaces appear more uniform, their edges blending into the surrounding texture. The horizon remains distant, unchanged, offering no difference that might draw attention outward. The eye accepts what is visible without seeking variation. Sound persists, though it now feels even further removed from awareness. The water moves, the structure responds, but the rhythm no longer anchors perception. It continues without interruption, yet it no longer defines the experience in the same way. It becomes part of a broader quiet, constant and unbroken, existing without demanding recognition. Time continues without division, though its passage carries less connection to change. The condition holds steady across moments that do not distinguish themselves through variation. The body does not track this passage. It remains within it, responding less frequently, adjusting only when necessary to maintain its position within the narrowing range. You remain at a distance, observing as the quiet of this condition deepens without altering its form. Nothing sharpens. Nothing resolves. The dryness does not demand attention. It persists, shaping the body through its steady presence. The surface continues its motion, unchanged, carrying everything within a condition that does not lift, only settles more completely into what remains. The slowing of thought. The change does not begin as a loss. It begins as a lengthening, an extension of the space between one thought and the next. Nothing disappears at once. The mind continues to move, but it does so with less urgency, as though the distance it must travel has increased without altering its direction. A thought forms, holds briefly, then lingers longer than it once did before giving way to what follows. The sequence remains intact, though it unfolds more slowly, with pauses that do not yet interrupt its continuity. The body does not react to this shift directly. It continues within the same narrowed range of movement, maintaining posture, adjusting to the surface as required. The change occurs alongside these actions, not within them. Movements still complete themselves, though they are accompanied by a quieter awareness, one that does not fully track each adjustment as it happens. The connection between thought and motion remains, but it stretches slightly, allowing moments to pass without being fully registered. Memory begins to hold less detail. It does not disappear, but it loses its edges. Recent moments blend more easily into one another, forming a continuous field rather than distinct points. What occurred just before is no longer clearly separated from what is happening now. The mind does not attempt to clarify this. It accepts the softening, allowing impressions to merge without resistance. The gaze follows this change, lingering less on any single point. It moves slowly across the immediate space, but it does not fix on details with the same clarity. Surfaces that once offered distinction now appear more uniform, their differences less defined. The eye does not refine what it sees. It passes over it, carrying a general impression rather than a precise image. The horizon remains distant, unchanged, offering no variation that might draw attention outward. Breathing continues in its steady rhythm, though it no longer aligns as closely with the movement of thought. The two processes, once loosely connected, begin to separate. The breath follows its pattern without being observed as closely. It continues without interruption, maintaining the same depth and pace, though its presence within awareness diminishes slightly. The hands remain in place, their movements reduced to what is necessary. When they adjust, the motion is slower, less precise, though still sufficient to maintain contact. The surfaces beneath them are felt, but without the same level of detail. Texture becomes generalized, pressure more uniform. The interaction persists, though it no longer carries the same clarity of perception. Sound continues, though it recedes further into the background. The rhythm of water remains unchanged, but it no longer defines the environment as strongly. It becomes part of a broader quiet, steady and unbroken. The mind does not attend to it in the same way. It exists alongside other sensations, none of which stand apart clearly enough to draw focus. There are moments when thought pauses entirely, not as an interruption, but as a continuation without content. The mind does not fill these spaces immediately. It allows them to remain unoccupied until another thought forms slowly in their place. These intervals do not feel empty. They feel consistent with the rest of the condition, extending the same continuity that defines everything else. You observe as the pace of thought continues to slow, not through loss, but through extension. Nothing disappears. It simply takes longer to arrive, longer to pass. The surface continues its steady motion, unchanged, carrying everything within a rhythm that no longer demands immediate response. The mind follows this pattern, settling into a pace that mirrors what surrounds it, where movement remains, but urgency has quietly fallen away. The intervals between thoughts extend further, though they no longer feel like gaps. They settle into the same continuity as everything else, forming a steady field where beginnings and endings are less defined. A thought emerges without urgency, holds briefly, then fades without leaving a clear boundary behind. What follows does not arrive immediately. It forms gradually, as though drawn from a distance that cannot be measured, then takes its place within the same quiet progression. The connection between thought and the body continues to loosen in small, consistent ways. Movements still occur when required, but they are no longer accompanied by the same level of awareness. A hand shifts slightly along the surface, finding a new position without the mind tracing each step of the motion. The adjustment completes itself without interruption, yet it does not leave a clear imprint within memory. The action exists, then passes, without being held. Memory continues to soften, blending impressions into a continuous presence that does not separate moments clearly. What has just occurred remains accessible, but without sharp distinction. It does not stand apart from what is happening now. Instead, it merges into the same field, contributing to a sense of continuity that does not rely on sequence. The mind does not organize these impressions. It allows them to remain as they are, without structure. The gaze reflects this change, moving less frequently and with less intention. It no longer searches for detail. It rests within the immediate space, accepting what is visible without refining it. Surfaces appear as broad forms rather than defined objects. Edges soften further, blending into the surrounding texture. The horizon remains distant, unchanged, offering no variation that might draw the eye outward. It becomes part of the same undifferentiated field. Breathing continues steadily, though it now occurs with minimal awareness. The rhythm persists without being observed closely, maintaining the same pace and depth without adjustment. It becomes part of the background, consistent and unbroken, aligning with the broader continuity that holds everything within it. The body does not intervene. It allows the pattern to continue on its own. The hands remain in place, their contact with the surface sustained without variation. When movement occurs, it does so slowly, without precision, completing itself without drawing attention. The surfaces beneath them feel uniform, their distinctions reduced to a general sense of contact that does not change. The interaction persists, though it no longer carries detail that might separate one moment from another. Sound continues as it always has, though it now exists at the edge of perception. The water moves, the structure responds, but the rhythm no longer anchors awareness. It becomes part of a broader quiet, constant and unbroken, present without requiring attention. The mind does not follow it. It allows it to remain as a background presence that does not shift or develop. There are longer intervals now where thought does not form at all. The mind remains within these spaces without attempting to fill them. They do not feel incomplete. They extend the same continuity that defines everything else, holding steady without variation. When a thought does emerge, it does so slowly, without urgency, then fades again into the same field. You remain at a distance, observing as the pace of thought continues to lengthen. Nothing is removed. Nothing is lost in a way that can be marked. Instead, everything stretches, allowing more space between what was once closely connected. The surface continues its steady motion, unchanged, carrying everything within a rhythm that no longer demands immediate awareness. The mind follows, settling into a state where movement remains, but definition has quietly diminished. The softening of edges. The environment does not change in form, yet the way it is received begins to shift further. Surfaces remain where they have always been, the water continues its steady motion, and the structure holds its shape within the same narrow range. What alters is not what exists, but how clearly it separates from everything else. The distinctions that once defined one element from another begin to soften, not abruptly, but through a gradual reduction in contrast that does not call attention to itself. The edge where the surface meets the structure becomes less precise. It is still visible, still present, but it no longer holds a clear boundary. The water does not appear to stop at a defined line. It blends into the material it touches, the transition between them becoming more continuous. The eye does not correct this. It accepts the merging, allowing forms to remain less defined without attempting to separate them. The body reflects this same change in perception. Contact points that once felt distinct, wood against skin, fabric against air, begin to register as more uniform. The differences do not disappear completely, but they lose their clarity. Pressure becomes more generalized, less tied to specific locations. The hands rest where they have been, though their sense of position becomes less precise, guided more by continuity than by distinct feedback. The posture holds, though the sense of alignment within it becomes less exact. The shoulders remain lowered, the spine maintains its curve, but the body no longer registers small deviations in the same way. Adjustments occur less frequently, not only because movement has narrowed, but because the need to correct subtle misalignments has diminished. The position persists, though it no longer feels as clearly defined. The gaze remains within the immediate space, though it now moves even less. When it does shift, it passes over forms that no longer present themselves with sharp distinction. Objects appear as broader shapes, their edges blending into the surrounding environment. The eye does not refine what it sees. It holds a general impression, allowing detail to remain unresolved. The horizon, distant and unchanged, merges further into the sky, its boundaries soften to the point where it no longer separates clearly. Breathing continues in its steady rhythm, though it no longer stands apart as a distinct process. It occurs within the same field of continuity as everything else, neither drawing attention nor marking intervals. Each breath follows the next without distinction, maintaining its pattern without defining itself against the surrounding condition. Sound persists, though it now exists as a single, continuous presence. The water moves, the structure responds, but the variations between individual sounds are no longer clear. They merge into a uniform tone that does not rise or fall. The ear does not separate one contact from another. It receives the sound as part of a broader field, constant and unbroken. Thought continues in its slowed state, though it now carries less structure. Ideas form without sharp edges, blending into one another without clear separation. The mind does not organize them into sequence. It allows them to exist within the same continuous field, where one thought does not fully end before another begins. The space between them remains, but it no longer feels distinct. You observe as the environment holds its form while losing its definition. Nothing has changed in substance. The water continues to move, the structure continues to carry, the body continues to persist. Yet the clarity that once separated each element has softened, allowing everything to exist within a shared, indistinct continuity that no longer requires precise distinction to remain intact. The blending continues without pause, though it no longer appears as a change in progress. It has settled into a condition where separation is no longer required to understand what remains. The water, the structure, the body, they continue to exist as distinct elements, yet the boundaries between them no longer hold the same clarity. Each surface meets another without a defined line, transitioning gradually rather than dividing cleanly. The eye does not search for those lines. It allows them to remain unresolved. The hands maintain their contact with the structure, though the sense of placement has shifted further. Where they rest is still known, but not with the same precision. Pressure is felt as a general presence rather than a specific point. The fingers curve as they have, though their position within that curve does not register clearly. Movement, when it occurs, is guided by continuity rather than by exact feedback, completing itself without needing to define each stage. The posture holds within the same narrowed form, though the awareness of alignment has softened. The shoulders remain lowered, the spine curved, but the body no longer distinguishes small changes within that position. If a shift occurs, it is absorbed into the overall shape rather than corrected. The form persists, not because it is maintained actively, but because it no longer requires active maintenance to continue. The gaze rests within a limited field that has lost its sharp distinctions. Surfaces appear as gradients rather than edges, their transitions smooth and continuous. The eye moves slowly, not seeking detail, but registering presence in a more general way. The horizon blends further into the sky, its boundary now more suggestion than line. It remains visible, yet it no longer separates one space from another in a way that demands attention. Breathing continues, though it has merged almost completely into the surrounding condition. It no longer stands apart as a distinct rhythm. It occurs within the same continuity that defines everything else, steady and unbroken, without drawing awareness to itself. The body does not observe it. It allows it to continue without interruption, integrated fully into the broader state. Sound persists, though it has become nearly indistinguishable from silence. The water moves, the structure responds, but the variations that once defined individual sounds have blended into a single, continuous presence. It does not rise or fall. It does not interrupt. It remains, constant and even, existing without requiring recognition. Thought continues in its slowed, softened state, though it now holds less distinction between one idea and the next. Impressions form and dissolve without clear boundaries, blending into one another without sequence. The mind does not separate them. It allows them to exist within the same field, where continuity replaces structure. The intervals between thoughts remain, though they no longer feel separate from the thoughts themselves. Time continues without division, though its passage carries even less connection to change. Moments do not stand apart. They blend into one another, forming a continuous presence that does not mark progression. The body does not track this passage. It remains within it, unchanged in its approach, responding only when necessary to maintain its position. You remain at a distance, observing as the condition settles into its most unified form so far. Nothing stands apart clearly enough to draw distinction. The surface continues its motion, the structure carries, the body persists, yet all of it exists within a shared continuity where separation has softened into something quieter, more complete, and less defined than before. The quiet of letting go. Nothing announces the shift. It does not arrive as a decision, nor as a clear moment that can be identified. The condition continues as it has, the surface moving, the structure holding, the body remaining within its narrowed form. Yet within that continuity, something begins to ease, not in the environment, not in the rhythm, but in the quiet relationship between the body and what it has been sustaining. The effort that once held posture in place does not disappear. It loosens. The shoulders remain lowered, but the tension that maintained their position softens further, no longer holding with the same quiet insistence. The spine continues its curve, though it no longer resists small deviations with the same consistency. These changes do not alter the form immediately. They settle within it, allowing slight variations to remain where they might once have been corrected. The hands maintain their contact, though the nature of that contact shifts. Where they once sustained a steady presence against the surface, they now rest with less continuity. The fingers hold their curve, but they do not adjust as readily when the surface moves beneath them. The pressure becomes lighter in some moments, then returns without intention in others. The interaction persists, though it no longer carries the same quiet precision that defined it earlier. Breathing continues in its steady rhythm, though it now carries a subtle change in its relation to the body. It no longer feels anchored in the same way. Each breath arrives and leaves without the same sense of completion. The depth remains within its narrow range, but the connection between one breath and the next softens, as though the sequence no longer requires the same continuity to sustain itself. The gaze remains within its limited field, though it now holds even less distinction. Surfaces that once blended softly now appear as a continuous presence without clear separation. The eye does not move as frequently. When it does not settle on specific forms. It passes over them without defining them, allowing everything within view to remain part of the same undifferentiated field. Sound continues, though it has become nearly indistinguishable from the absence of it. The water moves, the structure responds, but the variations have dissolved into a constant presence that does not rise or fall. It remains without interruption, yet it no longer defines the environment in any noticeable way. It exists alongside everything else, neither separate nor distinct. Thought persists in its slowed, softened form, though it now carries even less structure. Impressions form without clear beginning or end, blending into one another without sequence. The intervals between them extend further, yet they do not feel separate from what surrounds them. The mind does not organize or refine them. It allows them to exist within the same continuous field. Time continues without division, though its passage carries no sense of movement from one state to another. The condition remains consistent, holding everything within it without progression. The body does not mark this passage. It remains within it, adjusting less, responding less, yet continuing within the same narrowing range. You observe as the condition shifts in a way that does not alter its form, only its relation to what it carries. Nothing is released fully. Nothing ends. Yet the quiet persistence that once held everything in place begins to loosen, allowing small variations to remain where they might once have been contained. The surface continues its steady motion, unchanged, carrying everything within a state that now requires less to be sustained. The easing continues without form, not as an action taken, but as a condition that settles further into what remains. Nothing is released all at once. The body does not abandon its position in any clear movement. Instead, the small consistencies that once held everything in quiet alignment begin to hold less firmly, allowing variation to remain where it might once have been absorbed without trace. The hands continue to rest against the surface, though their contact becomes less continuous. There are moments, brief and unmarked, when the pressure lightens almost completely, as though the connection has loosened without fully breaking. When it returns, it does so without intention, settling back into place without restoring what had been there before. The fingers maintain their shape, though they no longer adjust with the same quiet persistence. Movement, when it occurs, does not complete itself as precisely. It lingers, then settles without correction. The posture holds, though it now carries a subtle imbalance that is no longer resolved immediately. The shoulders remain lowered, but they do not return to the same exact position after each shift. The spine maintains its curve, though small deviations remain where they once would have been corrected. The body does not respond to these changes with the same quiet effort. It allows them to persist, integrating them into the form rather than refining them away. Breathing continues, though its rhythm softens in its connection to itself. Each breath follows the last, but the sense of continuity between them becomes less defined. The transitions lengthen slightly, the pauses between inhalation and release extending without intention. The depth remains within its narrow range, though the pattern no longer holds as firmly. It continues, steady enough to persist, yet quieter in its structure. The gaze remains within its confined field, though it now carries almost no distinction at all. Surfaces no longer separate clearly from one another. The eye does not move with purpose. It rests, receiving what remains without defining it. The horizon, distant and softened beyond clarity, no longer suggests distance or direction. It becomes part of the same continuous presence, indistinguishable from the rest. Sound persists, though it has dissolved almost entirely into silence. The water continues its motion, the structure responds, but the variations that once formed a rhythm have blended into a single, unbroken tone that does not rise or fall. It remains constant, yet it no longer occupies awareness in any defined way. It exists as part of the same quiet field that holds everything else. Thought continues, though it now carries only the faintest structure. Impressions form slowly, without clear beginning or end, then dissolve before they can be held. The intervals between them extend further, though they do not feel separate. The mind no longer organizes them into sequence. It allows them to exist within a continuity that does not require distinction. Time remains without division, though its passage carries no sense of movement. Moments do not progress from one to the next. They remain, continuous and unbroken, without markers that might define their transition. The body does not respond to this passage. It remains within it, sustained by what little continues without needing to be maintained. You remain at a distance, observing as the condition settles into its quietest form. Nothing ends. Nothing resolves. Yet the persistence that once held everything in precise alignment has softened, allowing the smallest variations to remain. The surface continues its steady motion, unchanged, carrying everything within a state that no longer requires the same effort to endure, only the continuation of what has already become. The edge of stillness. The motion remains, yet it no longer defines what is most present. The surface continues its slow rise and fall, carrying the same quiet rhythm that has persisted without interruption. But within that rhythm, something else settles, something that does not move in the same way. It does not replace the motion. It exists alongside it, reducing its importance until the difference between movement and stillness begins to narrow. The body remains where it has been, though its response to the surface becomes even less pronounced. Adjustments occur rarely now, and when they do, they complete themselves without restoring the alignment that once followed. The posture holds, though it no longer returns to a consistent form after each shift. Small variations remain, not corrected, not refined, simply carried forward into what follows. The hands rest with minimal contact, their presence against the surface lighter than before. There are longer intervals where the connection feels almost absent, where pressure fades without fully disappearing. When contact returns, it does so without intention, settling into place without re-establishing the continuity that once held it steady. The fingers maintain their shape, though their position within that shape becomes less defined. Breathing continues, though it has become quieter in its structure. The rhythm persists, but it no longer carries the same sense of sequence. The pauses between breaths extend further, though they do not feel separate from the breaths themselves. Each cycle continues, though the transitions between them soften, allowing the pattern to exist without clearly defined boundaries. The gaze remains open, though it no longer focuses on any particular point. Surfaces within view have lost their distinction almost entirely, blending into a continuous field that does not separate into forms. The eye does not move to refine this. It remains within it, receiving what is present without organizing it into detail. The horizon, softened beyond recognition, no longer suggests distance or division. Sound has settled into something nearly indistinguishable from silence. The water continues its motion, the structure responds, but the variations that once defined a rhythm have dissolved completely. What remains is a presence that does not rise or fall, existing without interruption, yet without clarity. It no longer anchors the environment. It simply exists within it. Thought continues at the edge of formation, though it now appears only briefly before dissolving. Impressions emerge without structure, then fade without leaving a clear trace. The intervals between them extend further, though they do not feel empty. They hold the same continuity as everything else, allowing the mind to remain without needing to fill them. Time continues without any sense of movement between moments. It does not progress. It remains, continuous and unbroken, without markers that might define its passage. The body does not respond to it. It remains within it, sustained by what little continues without requiring maintenance. You observe as the condition approaches a state where movement and stillness no longer stand apart. The surface continues its motion, unchanged, yet what it carries responds less and less to it. The distinction fades, leaving only a quiet persistence that holds everything within a field where change no longer needs to be recognized in order to occur. The motion continues, though it no longer separates itself from what has settled within it. The rise and fall of the surface remains, unchanged in form, yet it no longer defines the experience as it once did. It carries without guiding, moves without requiring response. What remains within it does not resist, does not adjust with the same quiet persistence. It rests within the motion without following it completely, allowing small differences to remain where they once would have been absorbed. The body holds its position, though the sense of holding has diminished further. The posture remains, but it no longer returns to a consistent form after each shift. Variations settle into place and remain, no longer refined by adjustment. The shoulders maintain their lowered angle, though they do not correct slight changes in position. The spine follows its curve, though it no longer aligns itself fully with the movement beneath it. The form persists, though it no longer restores itself to what it was. The hands remain in contact, though the continuity of that contact has weakened. There are longer intervals now where the pressure fades almost entirely, where the connection between surface and skin becomes indistinct. When it returns, it does so without restoring the sense of placement that once accompanied it. The fingers maintain their shape, though their position within that shape is no longer clearly felt. Movement, when it occurs, is minimal and unresolved, settling without correction. Breathing continues, though it has softened into something quieter than rhythm. Each breath follows the last, though the sequence no longer holds the same clarity. The pauses extend further, blending into the breaths themselves until the distinction between movement and stillness within the body becomes less defined. The pattern persists, though it no longer requires the same continuity to remain. The gaze remains open, though it no longer receives distinction. What lies within view exists as a continuous presence without defined form. The eye does not shift to refine it. It rests within it, holding what remains without separating it into parts. The horizon has dissolved into the same field, no longer marking distance or direction, only existing as part of the same quiet continuity. Sound has settled completely into silence, though the motion that once produced it continues. The water moves, the structure responds, but the variations have dissolved into a presence that no longer registers as sound. It remains without interruption, yet it does not define itself. It exists within the same stillness that has formed around everything else. Thought appears only faintly, emerging slowly, without structure, then dissolving before it can be held. The intervals between impressions extend into a continuity that no longer requires content. The mind remains within these spaces without filling them, allowing them to persist without distinction. What forms does not remain long enough to create sequence. It becomes part of the same quiet field before it can take shape. Time no longer carries any sense of passage. It does not move from one moment to another. It holds, continuous and unbroken, without markers that might define change. The body does not respond to it. It remains within it, sustained by what little continues without needing to be maintained. You remain at a distance, observing as the condition settles at its quietest edge. The surface continues its motion, unchanged, yet what it carries no longer follows it in the same way. Movement persists, but it no longer separates itself from stillness. What remains is a continuity so complete that distinction fades entirely, leaving only a presence that does not need to change in order to continue. The return of distance. The surface continues, unchanged in its motion, though something within the wider field begins to separate again, not abruptly, but through a gradual reappearance of difference. It does not arrive as a clear form at first. It exists as a slight interruption in what had become continuous, a variation in tone, a faint shift along the horizon that does not resolve into shape immediately. The eye does not move toward it with intent. It receives it slowly, allowing the difference to remain without defining it. The horizon, which had softened into a single field, begins to hold a subtle contrast. It does not sharpen all at once. It gathers faint distinction, a suggestion that something beyond the immediate surface exists again. The boundary does not return as a line, but as a quiet unevenness, a place where continuity does not extend in exactly the same way. The eye lingers there slightly longer than before, though without urgency. The body remains within its stillness, though the presence of difference begins to alter its relation to what surrounds it. There is no immediate movement toward it, no restoration of the earlier responses that once followed variation. The posture holds, the hands rest, the breathing continues. Yet something within that continuity begins to register the change, not as a signal to act, but as a shift that does not belong to what has been sustained. The gaze remains soft, though it begins to hold slightly longer at the point where the difference appears. It does not refine what it sees. The shapes remain indistinct, their edges not yet formed. The eye does not correct this. It allows the suggestion of form to exist without confirming it. The horizon remains distant, but no longer entirely merged with the sky. Sound remains quiet, though the absence that had formed around it feels less complete. The motion of water continues, though it does not return as a defined rhythm. It remains within the same subdued presence, yet the sense of silence no longer holds with the same totality. There is a slight variation, not clearly heard, but sensed as part of the environment shifting beyond its previous state. Breathing continues in its softened rhythm, though it now carries a faint irregularity that does not align with the earlier pattern. The pauses between breaths remain extended, though they no longer feel entirely continuous with the breaths themselves. A slight distinction returns, not enough to define sequence clearly, but enough to suggest separation where there had been none. The hands maintain their position, though the sense of contact shifts subtly. Pressure remains light, though it now carries a faint awareness that had nearly disappeared. The surfaces beneath them do not change, but the perception of them holds slightly more distinction than before. The interaction remains quiet, though it no longer dissolves entirely into the background. Thought remains faint, though it begins to gather in slightly more defined impressions. They do not form into structured ideas, but they hold their presence longer before dissolving. The intervals between them remain, though they now feel more separate from what surrounds them. The mind does not act on them. It allows them to exist without extending them further. You observe as distance returns, not as a destination, but as a condition that begins to separate what had become continuous. The surface continues its steady motion, unchanged in its form. Yet within that motion, a faint distinction appears, suggesting something beyond what has been held. It does not call for movement. It remains, quiet and unresolved, existing as the first difference within a field that had nearly lost all of its boundaries. The difference does not resolve into form immediately. It holds at the edge of recognition, present enough to remain, yet not defined enough to be named. The horizon carries it unevenly, a faint irregularity that interrupts the continuity that had settled so completely. It does not sharpen. It lingers, allowing the eye to rest against it without confirming what it is. The surface beneath continues its steady motion, unchanged, carrying everything within the same restrained rhythm. The gaze remains soft, though it returns more often to that distant variation. It does not search. It does not fix. It rests there briefly, then drifts back toward the immediate space, repeating this movement without intention. The difference remains at the edge of perception, not drawing the eye outward fully, yet not disappearing into the background as it once did. It exists as something that does not belong entirely to what has been sustained. The body holds its position, though its relation to the environment shifts in a way that does not yet produce movement. The posture remains unchanged, the hands rest with the same light contact, the breathing continues in its softened rhythm. Yet within this stillness, there is a slight alteration, not in form, but in awareness. The condition that had settled into complete continuity begins to loosen at its edges, allowing faint distinctions to persist where they once dissolved. The hands maintain their contact, though the sensation carries a subtle return of definition. Pressure remains light, but it no longer fades entirely between moments. The surfaces beneath them feel slightly more present, though still without clear texture. The interaction does not change outwardly. It continues within the same narrow range, though it now holds a faint sense of placement that had nearly disappeared. Breathing continues, though its rhythm now separates slightly between cycles. The pauses between breaths remain extended, though they no longer blend completely into the breaths themselves. Each cycle holds a quiet distinction from the next, not enough to restore a clear sequence, but enough to suggest a pattern re-emerging from what had become continuous. Sound remains subdued, though the silence that had formed around it no longer feels complete. The motion of water persists, still quiet and unbroken, yet it carries a faint suggestion of variation. It does not return as a defined rhythm. It exists as a slight difference within the same continuous presence, indicating that the field is no longer entirely uniform. Thought gathers slightly, though it does not yet organize itself into clear structure. Impressions hold a moment longer before dissolving, carrying faint edges that separate them from the surrounding continuity. The intervals between them remain, though they now feel more distinct, allowing the mind to register them as separate from what follows. There is no extension into action. The impressions remain quiet, contained within themselves. Time continues without clear progression, though it now carries a faint sense of movement between moments. The continuity remains, but it is no longer complete. Small distinctions appear, separating one interval from another in ways that do not yet define sequence. The body does not respond to this shift with action. It remains within its stillness, allowing the change to unfold without interruption. You remain at a distance, observing as the field that had settled into complete continuity begins to separate at its edges. Nothing resolves. Nothing becomes clear. Yet the difference persists, holding its place within the horizon, within the body, within the quiet return of distinction. The surface continues its steady motion, unchanged, carrying everything within a condition that now allows for the faintest suggestion that what lies beyond it may not be entirely the same. Epilogue: the water that remains. The surface continues long after distinction returns, holding the same quiet motion that has never altered in its nature. It does not remember what it has carried. It does not preserve the conditions that passed across it. The rise and fall remain, steady and without direction, shaping nothing beyond what rests upon it in each passing moment. Light moves across it in the same restrained way, softening and fading without marking time, without dividing what has been from what is. What remained upon it has already shifted beyond what can be observed here. The structure that once held its form does not define the surface that carried it. The body that moved within that narrowing space does not leave a trace that can be followed. The condition that settled, disconnection, drift, exposure, quiet erosion, has not altered the water that held it. It continues, unchanged, offering no reflection of what has passed across it. Elsewhere, beyond the surface that holds steady, distance has taken form again. Not as a sudden return, but as a gradual reappearance of difference. Shapes emerge where there had been none, carrying meaning that had dissolved within the continuity of open water. Movement returns in ways that extend beyond simple persistence, forming patterns that suggest direction once more. Yet these do not belong to the surface itself. They exist beyond it, separate from the condition it sustained. The body that remained within that quiet field has not carried its experience outward in a way that can be seen here. What occurred did not resolve into an action that marked its end. It settled, extended, softened, until it no longer required distinction to continue. The narrowing of movement, the persistence of exposure, the thinning of strength, the slowing of thought, all of it unfolded without interruption, without a clear boundary that might define where one state ended and another began. You remain at the edge of this surface, where nothing has changed, and nothing will. The water does not carry memory. It does not hold the quiet passage of those who have drifted upon it. It continues as it always has, reflecting light, absorbing motion, existing without direction or conclusion. The horizon stretches outward, soft and unbroken, offering no indication of what lies beyond it, only the suggestion that distance will always return, even after it has disappeared. And so what remains is not the outcome, but the condition itself, the quiet endurance of what persists without recognition, without resolution, held within a field that neither begins nor ends, only continues, steady and unchanged, beneath a sky that does not ask what has passed below it. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.